Dr. Emma Williams had always been captivated by the past, specifically the stories etched in ink and bound in fragile parchment. Her fascination with ancient texts wasn't just an academic pursuit, it was a lifelong obsession. As a manuscript restoration specialist, Emma found solace in the quiet, meticulous work of restoring the old pages to their former glory. The delicate process of cleaning ancient papyrus, stabilizing fading ink, and preserving the fragile bindings was a form of art in itself, a bridge between history and the present. At the age of 35, Emma had already achieved what many scholars in her field could only dream of, a position at Hargrove University, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the country. The university's vast collection of historical archives was renowned, housing some of the world's most precious manuscripts, and Emma was among the few trusted with their preservation. Her office, tucked away in a corner of the library, was a sanctuary where she spent most of her waking hours. It was a room cluttered with manuscripts of every shape and size, some dating back to the 4th century, others still bearing the faint scent of their medieval past. Despite the university's grand reputation, Emma had always found a certain tranquility in the quiet routine of her work. While other scholars raced to make their mark with groundbreaking discoveries, Emma preferred to be the silent observer, restoring the past so that future generations could experience the wisdom of long-forgotten voices. She never sought fame. Instead, she found fulfillment in the preservation of history, ensuring that the stories of the past were never lost to the ravages of time. Her colleagues admired her meticulous attention to detail, and Emma's reputation within the department was impeccable. Yet, for all her success, there was a deep part of her that yearned for something more. As much as she loved the manuscripts she worked on, there was an unspoken longing within her, a desire to uncover something that hadn't yet been discovered. To find a text, an unknown fragment, a story lost to history, something that would make her work truly matter. But she had come to accept that such discoveries were rare. Ancient manuscripts were often well documented, their secrets long since revealed. The archives at Hargrove University were more than just a storage space for old books. They were a treasure trove of knowledge, containing thousands of manuscripts, rare books, and forgotten scrolls. The university had been collecting ancient texts for centuries, and their archives stretched across several floors of the grand library building. The dimly lit halls were filled with the scent of old leather, dust, and age-old paper. It was a sanctuary, an environment where the weight of history hung in the air, making even the most mundane tasks feel like a sacred ritual. Emma's daily routine was built around this sanctum of knowledge. Each morning, she would make her way to the archives, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet, cavernous hallways. The work was slow and precise. Restoring a manuscript could take weeks, sometimes months, depending on the damage. There was always something to be done. A page to be repaired, ink to be stabilized, a binding to be reinforced. For Emma, this was more than just a job. It was a calling. Her work had its own rhythm. She would begin by carefully unpacking the manuscript for the day, setting up her tools, tweezers, brushes, archival tape, and magnifying glasses. She would carefully examine the damage before making her first incision into the aged paper. The process was painstakingly slow. Each mark, each tear, each fragile edge had a story to tell, and Emma was determined to listen to it. The clock would tick slowly as she worked, and hours would pass without her noticing. Though the archives were filled with history, Emma had come to know many of the manuscripts by heart. She had spent years working with texts that told the same stories, preserving the same messages, but always with the same limitations. The Codex Sinaiticus, the Book of Kells, and countless other well-known works filled the shelves. Each was unique in its own way, but they were all part of a well-established historical narrative. Emma's real joy came from the moments when she discovered an overlooked detail, a forgotten note, a misinterpreted symbol, a clue that pointed to something new. But those moments were rare, and Emma had learned not to expect too much. She often wondered, as she sat in the dim glow of the archival lights, if there were any unknown manuscripts hidden deep within the university's collections. Something unmarked, not yet uncovered. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was one last mystery waiting to be found, one that would change everything she knew about the past. One afternoon, as Emma was working on a manuscript that had recently arrived from a private collection, she was drawn to a small corner of the archive she had never explored. It was an area that was marked on the archive's floor plan, but somehow it was never listed among the documents she had to restore. It was a small storage room, tucked away behind a set of old bookshelves that had long since gathered dust. Curious, Emma made her way down the narrow hall, her footsteps muffled by the old wooden floors. When she reached the corner, she found a door marked only with the word storage. It was strange. She had never seen this room before, and it wasn't on the access list she regularly reviewed. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching before sliding her access card through the scanner. The door clicked open, and a rush of stale, old air greeted her. Inside, the room was filled with stacks of unlabeled boxes and crates, some of them several decades old. She made her way through the piles, her eyes scanning the shelves for anything unusual. It was a storage room, yes, but Emma was no stranger to the oddities that sometimes surfaced in the university's deep archives. As she walked further into the room, something caught her eye. Tucked in the back, behind several boxes of old documents, she saw a wooden chest, ancient in appearance and sealed tightly with metal clasps. The chest was heavy, its wood worn and cracked with age. It looked like it had been left untouched for years, if not decades. Curiosity piqued, Emma gently lifted the lid. Inside, she found a manuscript unmarked, unlisted, and completely out of place. It was bound in worn leather, with no title, no name, and no catalog number. The pages were fragile, but the manuscript appeared intact. A chill ran through her as she realized that this was no ordinary find. The manuscript was sealed, its edges marked with strange symbols that she had never seen before. Emma could feel the weight of the book in her hands, as though it was holding some kind of power that she was not yet ready to understand. She carefully removed the manuscript from the chest and placed it on the desk, her hands trembling slightly. A warning flashed in her mind: do not process. But Emma was a scholar, and her thirst for knowledge was too great to ignore. What had the university kept hidden away for so long? The manuscript, nestled within the worn wooden chest, was unlike anything Emma had ever encountered. The leather binding was cracked with age, but it held an undeniable allure. Something about it seemed both ancient and timeless, as if it were waiting for someone to find it. Emma's fingers brushed against the rough edges of the pages, feeling the brittle texture beneath her touch. The manuscript was heavy, and the moment she opened it, a faint scent of old ink and parchment filled the air. As she turned the first few pages, Emma was struck by the oddity of the text. The writing was dense and intricate, with a peculiar blend of Latin, Greek, and Old English. It wasn't a language she had seen before, but it had elements of all three. She could recognize fragments of the well-known Latin prayers and passages from ancient Greek philosophers, but the mixture seemed unnatural, foreign even. The mysterious symbols and strange scripts peppered throughout the pages further intrigued her. They looked like a cross between runic characters and some sort of arcane notation she couldn't identify. She noticed that the ink was still remarkably well preserved despite the manuscript's age. Each stroke seemed deliberate, even purposeful, as if the words had been carefully crafted to hold some deeper meaning, one that Emma couldn't yet decipher. Her academic curiosity surged. She had spent years studying ancient texts, unlocking their secrets, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. The structure of the writing, the blending of languages, the unfamiliar symbols, they were an enigma she couldn't ignore. Her fingers traced the edges of the text as her mind raced, her usual caution slipping away. This wasn't just another restoration project. It was a puzzle, a treasure trove of forgotten knowledge, and Emma was determined to unlock it. She carefully flipped through more pages, noting the consistent use of multiple languages, interwoven in a way that suggested an advanced understanding of linguistic structure. Some sections were written in Greek, others in Latin, but it wasn't until she reached the middle of the manuscript that she found something completely unexpected. An Old English passage, almost poetic in nature, written in a flowing script she had only encountered in her graduate studies. It was as though this manuscript was a bridge between civilizations, a text that had been passed down through centuries, combining different languages and traditions. But what stood out most was the theme. The pages contained a mix of religious teachings, ancient rituals, and visions of the divine. Emma quickly realized that this was no ordinary religious text. The manuscript didn't fit into the conventional canonical texts she was accustomed to. Some of the passages spoke of gods who were banished, demons bound by ancient rituals, and visions of the end of the world, while others seemed to describe supernatural phenomena that defied all logical explanation. Emma could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. Her hands trembled as she read on, her breath quickening with excitement. This was something rare, something powerful, but what it meant she had no idea. It was then that Emma noticed the notation on the first page of the manuscript, written in bold, red ink. "Do not process." Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the words, "Do not process." She had worked with hundreds of ancient manuscripts over the years, and never had she encountered a note like this. In her entire career, no manuscript had ever come with such a clear directive. Her academic mind immediately kicked into gear. What could this mean? Who would issue such a warning for a text to remain untouched? The university's archives were home to many rare and fragile texts, but every one of them had been properly cataloged, categorized, and restored by experts like Emma. There had never been a "do not touch" stamp, let alone a "do not process" label. For a moment, she considered putting the manuscript back in the chest and sealing it away as it had been. The rules, after all, were there for a reason. The warning was clear, but there was something about it that intrigued her even more. Why would anyone go to such lengths to keep this manuscript hidden? What was so dangerous about its contents? Emma leaned in closer, squinting at the red ink. It was official. The warning wasn't a mistake. It had been deliberately placed there. But why? Her fingers hovered over the edges of the manuscript. Should she leave it alone, or should she press on, unlocking the mysteries it seemed to hold? Her mind raced as she thought about all the years of study and training, the years of carefully restoring ancient manuscripts from cultures long gone. She had always followed the rules, always respected the boundaries set by her mentors and the university. But this was different. This manuscript felt like something meant to be discovered, a secret waiting to be uncovered. As the curiosity surged, she thought about the possibilities. What if this was a breakthrough? What if this manuscript held knowledge that could change history as we knew it? Could it hold the key to ancient rituals, lost spiritual wisdom, or perhaps even a forbidden gospel? The allure was irresistible. After a long pause, Emma knew she couldn't leave it. She had to investigate. Her rational mind told her to step away, to respect the warning, to not disturb what had been carefully concealed for so long. But her passion for the history of the written word was too strong, and her desire to understand the unknown was overpowering. She reached for her camera and began to photograph the pages, making sure to capture each section of the manuscript. As she clicked away, she carefully noted the intricate patterns, the blended languages, and the unusual symbols. Despite the warning, the manuscript felt like a treasure trove of forgotten knowledge, a puzzle begging to be solved. Emma spent the next several hours cataloging each page, photographing each line of text. Every time she snapped a picture, she felt her excitement growing. She knew she shouldn't be doing this, but it was as if the manuscript had cast a spell over her, urging her to uncover its secrets. She paused briefly to read a particularly strange section, a passage written in Old English that described a ritual to summon divine beings, something she had never seen before in any religious text. The temptation to understand it all was too great. She ignored the warning, just as she had ignored so many other cautions in her career, telling herself that she could always handle the consequences later. After all, she wasn't just any scholar. She was a specialist. She was trained to handle even the most delicate and dangerous materials. Emma carefully placed the manuscript on her desk and began to transcribe a portion of the text into her notebook. She wrote down the strange words, the cryptic symbols, and the portions of Latin and Greek that seemed familiar. But there were other symbols, ones she didn't recognize, that danced across the page, haunting her with their mystery. Emma couldn't stop herself. Every time she set the manuscript down, it seemed to pull her back, as though it were calling to her, urging her to uncover its secrets. The ink on the pages felt almost alive beneath her fingers, and as her eyes moved over the cryptic words, she could feel an unshakable connection forming between her and the text. She began with the first few chapters, transcribing the words with careful precision. The manuscript was written in a mixture of Latin, Greek, and Old English, a fusion she had never encountered before. Some passages were relatively simple, a translation that came easily to her. But as she delved deeper, the language became more complex, a hybrid of dialects, older than anything she had ever studied. It was as though the manuscript itself was alive, shifting and changing as she worked with it. The first revelation came when she uncovered a section of the text that described ancient gods, beings whose names were long forgotten, whose power had been erased from history. Goddesses of the moon, gods of the sea, and ancient kings who had once ruled over vast kingdoms. The names were unfamiliar, yet strangely familiar at the same time, as if they had been buried deep in the collective consciousness of mankind. The words spoke of a time long before recorded history, a time when divine beings walked the earth freely, influencing the lives of mortals. Emma could sense the weight of the knowledge on the pages. These were the kinds of secrets scholars and historians had spent lifetimes searching for: long-lost civilizations, forgotten rituals, and ancient gods whose power was now relegated to myth. But then, as Emma continued to turn the pages, she uncovered something darker. The manuscript began to shift from ancient gods and lost civilizations to something more sinister. Emma found herself trembling as she translated the next passage, which described the banishment of ancient entities, beings not merely gods, but something far more powerful and dangerous. They were not gods of worship or reverence, but rather beings of immense power who had once ruled over the earth, commanding the elements and bending reality to their will. The manuscript referred to these entities as the fallen, beings cast out of this world by forces greater than even they could comprehend. They were banished from Earth long ago and imprisoned in the hidden realms, sealed away by ancient rituals and divine forces. The text spoke of a cosmic war, a battle between the forces of light and darkness, where these entities had fought to rule over all creation. What was more troubling, though, was the implication. The manuscript hinted that these beings were not entirely gone. It suggested that they could be summoned, released from their eternal prison, through specific rituals, rituals buried in the pages of the text she was now holding in her hands. Emma felt a chill creep up her spine as she read the next line. It was not just a record of the past. The text spoke of how to bring these entities back, how to unlock the seals and set them free. "Speak their names aloud," the manuscript warned, "and you shall bring them forth from their chains." Her mind raced as she tried to process what she was reading. This was no ordinary religious manuscript. It wasn't just a collection of historical records or divine teachings. It was a manual for invoking the powers of the ancient world, a guide to unlocking forbidden knowledge. The more she read, the clearer it became. This knowledge was not meant to be uncovered. It was meant to stay hidden, locked away for eternity. As Emma continued translating, a strange unease began to settle in her chest. What had started as a thrilling academic discovery was quickly becoming a terrifying ordeal. The more she translated, the more the text seemed to come alive. It was as though the manuscript was reaching out to her, connecting with her on some deeper, unseen level. The words she read echoed in her mind long after she had closed the manuscript for the night, and they seeped into her thoughts when she least expected it. She found more and more details about the rituals that could summon the entities, the exact words to speak, the symbols to draw, and the items required to open the gateways. The text warned of terrible consequences if the rituals were not performed properly, but Emma's academic drive only pushed her further. What would happen, she wondered, if she tried it herself? With every page she uncovered, she could feel the power of the manuscript taking hold of her. She was no longer just studying it. She was becoming part of it. The words were mesmerizing, pulling her deeper into the text's dark mystery. Her sense of self-control started to slip. There were moments when she wasn't sure if she was reading the manuscript or if the manuscript was reading her. Emma's thoughts grew more and more fragmented, and soon she realized that she could not stop herself. The text described how to summon the entities, how to bring them back to Earth and grant them dominion. The descriptions grew more vivid, more compelling, until they seemed to fill the space around her. She could almost feel the presence of the entities in the room, their silent, waiting power. The manuscript had done its job. It had captured her completely. Emma couldn't stop herself from reading more, even though she knew deep down that this knowledge was too dangerous to possess. Each time she looked at the manuscript, the knowledge seemed to reach deeper into her mind, pulling her closer to something dark and powerful. In the back of her mind, she heard a voice, faint at first but growing louder with each page she translated. "You know what to do," it whispered. "You can set us free. Just speak the words, and we will reward you." Emma felt the weight of the words, the lure of the power they promised. But deep down she knew that this was not just knowledge. It was a curse. A curse that would destroy everything she had ever known. Yet she couldn't stop. It was late one evening when Emma's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages, her eyes scanning the ancient text once again. The manuscript, with its strange fusion of languages and symbols, had become an obsession. She had barely slept in days, her mind consumed by the cryptic passages she was deciphering. Her entire world seemed to revolve around it, every moment spent working, translating, analyzing, and wondering. As Emma read one particular passage aloud, something felt different. The words rolled off her tongue more easily than the others, as if they had been waiting for her to speak them. The ancient Latin text intertwined with a Greek invocation, a call that seemed to have no equal in history. The words were not just written, they felt alive, as if the manuscript itself had been waiting for the right moment to awaken. The air around Emma grew colder. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. A strange shiver ran down her spine, and for the briefest moment, the shadows in the room seemed to shift. Emma took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling that something had changed. But she couldn't ignore it. She knew that she had accidentally summoned something that shouldn't have been awakened. A voice, low and distant, echoed faintly in her mind, as though coming from a deep well. She could almost hear it, but not quite. The voice was familiar yet foreign, an unsettling presence that lingered at the edges of her thoughts. "You've called us, mortal." The voice was barely a whisper at first, almost like a breath of wind in the room, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it was speaking directly to her. Her heartbeat quickened and she closed the manuscript, shaking her head, trying to clear her mind. Had she imagined it? But the voice came again, more insistent this time, with an eerie calmness that tugged at her very soul. "You've set us free." At first, the presence of the entity was subtle, a persistent hum at the back of Emma's consciousness. It didn't scream or demand her attention. Instead, it whispered, soft and soothing, like an old acquaintance gently guiding her thoughts. Emma tried to brush it off as the result of too many late nights spent working on the manuscript. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, the voice lingered, feeding on her every thought. The more she translated the manuscript, the more the entity's presence wrapped itself around her mind, like a tendril creeping through her thoughts. At first, it was nothing more than a strange sensation, a vague feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes were studying her every move. But the voice, it grew stronger. It spoke to her in riddles and cryptic messages, offering glimpses of ancient truths, secrets long lost to time. The more Emma engaged with the manuscript, the more the entity fed on her curiosity and desire for knowledge. It seemed to know exactly what she wanted, what she sought in the pages of the text. It wasn't just offering her knowledge, it was manipulating her, leading her deeper into its web of secrets. Emma started having disturbing dreams. Night after night, she saw the same dark figure standing at the edge of her vision, a shadow in the distance, watching her. The figure was always just out of reach, its face hidden, its presence overwhelming. In her dreams, it spoke in a language she couldn't understand, yet its meaning was clear. It wanted her to continue. Every time she opened the manuscript, the whispers grew louder, more persistent. The voice would guide her as she read, urging her to unveil deeper secrets, to speak more words aloud. Emma couldn't explain why, but she was drawn to it, compelled to continue to uncover the unknown. She could feel the entity's power growing, its grip tightening around her mind. It wasn't just talking to her anymore. It was shaping her thoughts, controlling her desires. Her once independent will began to weaken, and she couldn't tell where her own thoughts ended and the entity's influence began. She found herself constantly questioning her own motivations, wondering if she was still in control or if she had become a mere vessel for the entity's will. Emma tried to resist. She tried to stop reading the manuscript, to step away from the voice that was now echoing inside her head, but it was impossible. Every time she closed the book, the whispers followed her, like an invisible thread pulling her back. The voice was persistent, always there, always beckoning her to continue. "You cannot stop," it said, its tone growing darker, more commanding. "You must finish what you have started." The line between knowledge and power blurred as Emma found herself sinking deeper into the manuscript. The text became her obsession. She no longer cared about the consequences. The entity's voice promised her more answers, more truths, more control over the mysteries of the world. What had started as an intellectual pursuit had become a desperate race to uncover everything the entity had hidden within the pages. But as she read on, Emma began to realize that the entity wasn't just guiding her, it was using her. She had become a puppet, dancing to its tune. Every passage she uncovered seemed to open a new door, but each door led to a deeper, darker place. The entity was feeding off her, drawing power from her curiosity, her desire to know the truth. It was shaping her thoughts, bending her will to its own purposes. Emma knew she was losing herself, but she couldn't stop. The more she read, the more the entity's grip tightened. Her once clear thoughts became muddled and fragmented. What had once been her passion for historical discovery was now replaced by an overwhelming need to please the entity, to unlock more knowledge. There were moments, fleeting moments, when she tried to remember her true purpose, to restore ancient manuscripts, to preserve history. But those moments were growing fewer, and the entity's whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. Emma realized with growing horror that she wasn't just unlocking secrets, she was unleashing something far more dangerous. She was opening doors that should never have been opened, and the price of knowledge was more than she could have ever anticipated. As the entity's influence grew stronger, Emma felt herself slipping further away from her own mind, losing her sense of self. She could feel the weight of its presence constantly, like a shadow looming over her, watching her every move. The more she read, the more she lost control, and the more the entity's true nature began to reveal itself. It was not just an observer, it was a force, a being of immense power, manipulating her every thought, every action. And in the deepest recesses of her mind, Emma knew the truth. The entity was feeding off her curiosity, and the more she uncovered, the harder it would be to break free. She was in a struggle of will, not just against the entity, but against herself, against the desire for knowledge that had pulled her into this trap in the first place. The first signs were subtle, a persistent headache that wouldn't go away, a cold chill that crept over her skin even on the warmest of days. Emma thought it was simply the result of the long hours she had been putting in at the archives. After all, the stress of restoring ancient manuscripts could often take a toll on her body. But this was different. The exhaustion didn't lift, no matter how much sleep she tried to catch up on. Each morning, she found herself waking up more tired than before, her body aching and her mind foggy. She couldn't explain it. It was as though something inside her was draining her, sucking away her energy piece by piece. Her fingers trembled as she carefully laid out the manuscript each day. Her hands shook when she tried to pour herself a cup of coffee, the liquid spilling over the edge of the cup as if her body couldn't quite obey her commands. Her nights were the worst. The insomnia had grown more severe, keeping her awake long into the early hours. Emma tried to sleep, but the moment her eyes closed, the darkness around her seemed to swallow her whole, filling her mind with whispers and shadows that weren't her own. The entity was there, lurking just beneath the surface of her thoughts. She could feel its presence, ever present, its influence growing with each passing day. Her physical symptoms worsened. The headaches became more intense, and the chills morphed into waves of nausea. She couldn't focus on her work like she used to. Words on the page blurred and shifted as if the text was no longer a simple manuscript but a living, breathing thing. She began to question herself. Was it the manuscript causing this? Or was it something else, something she couldn't control? It wasn't long before the hallucinations began. It started small at first, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, the flicker of lights when she was certain they had been steady. She brushed them off as fatigue or perhaps her mind simply being too overstimulated by the ancient text she had been obsessing over. But then the images became clearer. One night, as she sat at her desk, the faint outline of a dark figure appeared in the farthest corner of the room. Emma blinked, but it didn't disappear. The figure moved, taking a step forward, but no sound accompanied it. It wasn't until it moved closer that Emma realized it wasn't just a shadow. It had a shape, a presence that felt all too real. The figure was tall, humanoid, and shrouded in a cloak of whispering darkness. Its face was indistinct, like a fog that blocked her view. But Emma felt it looking at her, watching her every move. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to force herself to look away, but the figure stayed, its shape seeming to shift with every glance. She turned on the lights, but the figure remained, flickering in and out of existence. Emma's heart raced, and the air around her grew thick, heavy, as if the room itself had grown cold. The hallucinations didn't stop there. The voices began again. The whispers she had once thought were her imagination now seemed more real, more coherent. They spoke to her in a language she didn't understand, and then, in a voice she knew too well, it said her name. Emma. The sound of her name echoed in her mind like a dark chant. She clutched her head, trying to block out the intrusive thoughts. It wasn't just voices now, it was visions. Faces appeared before her in flashes, strange, distorted faces that seemed to reach out, staring with eyes that held ancient sorrow. She saw dark, ruined landscapes, barren and twisted, cities that had long since fallen, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to crack. Each hallucination was more vivid than the last, and Emma couldn't tell what was real anymore. Her mind began to warp and fracture, and her body grew more and more fatigued. She couldn't differentiate between the physical world and the nightmares that had begun to plague her every waking moment. As the hallucinations and symptoms worsened, Emma became more withdrawn. She started to spend even more time in the archives, hiding herself away in the quiet, solitary spaces among the dusty bookshelves. The manuscript consumed her thoughts, and the entity's voice continued to haunt her, pushing her to read more, to learn more, to unlock its ancient power. She couldn't stop, no matter how hard she tried. Her colleagues noticed the changes, how she became more distant, how she would lose track of time and seem disconnected when they spoke to her. They tried to reach out to offer support, but Emma began to shut them out. She wasn't interested in their concern. She only cared about the manuscript now. There was one colleague in particular, David, a fellow historian who had tried to help her. He had noticed the difference in her behavior a few weeks ago. He asked her to take a break, to step away from the archives, but Emma brushed him off, unable to explain the magnetic pull that the manuscript had on her. Each time David approached her, she felt a wall between them, an invisible barrier that seemed to grow taller the longer she stayed absorbed in the manuscript's pages. Her friendships deteriorated as well. She had been so close to her old friends, but now Emma couldn't recall the last time she'd called her mother or even attended the regular social gatherings she once enjoyed. The entity's presence had become so overwhelming, its whispers so persistent, that she couldn't spare time for anything else. Everything and everyone else faded into the background, overshadowed by the manuscript's ancient secrets. At night, she would lay in bed, her body stiff and restless, staring at the ceiling as the whispers continued. Sometimes, they became louder, urgent, demanding that she keep going, that she complete the manuscript's secrets, no matter the cost. Emma could feel herself losing grip on reality, and yet she didn't know how to stop. It was as if the manuscript had become her only purpose, her only identity. The entity had succeeded in what it had intended. It had isolated her completely, cut off her connections to the world around her. Emma was now entirely alone, consumed by the power of the knowledge she had uncovered. She had crossed the line from curiosity into obsession, and the more she fed into it, the further she sank into a place of psychological ruin. The whispers had become a constant presence in Emma's mind, a low hum that never ceased, no matter how much she tried to block it out. The more she read the manuscript, the stronger the voice grew. It was no longer just an occasional whisper. It had become a steady stream of thoughts, infiltrating every corner of her consciousness. The entity no longer spoke in riddles or cryptic phrases. Now it addressed her directly, commanding her attention. "You are mine now, Emma," it said, its voice sharp and confident like an old friend who had suddenly turned threatening. The words were not just whispers, they echoed in her mind, resounding with an undeniable force. "You know too much now to turn back. You feel it, don't you? The power that comes with knowledge." Emma recoiled at the words, but they were right. She could feel the change, the shift in herself as the entity's power over her increased. The more she delved into the manuscript, the more addicted she became to the knowledge it offered. The words seemed to speak directly to her, tapping into her deepest fears and desires, feeding off them like a parasite. Every time she tried to push the manuscript aside, its pull only grew stronger, more compelling. It wasn't just the entity's words that had power over her. It was the emotions they evoked. Fear, curiosity, and desire intertwined in her heart, a constant storm brewing within her. The desire for more knowledge clashed with her growing terror of what she was uncovering. But the entity knew exactly how to twist these feelings, making her crave more, even as she felt herself losing her grip on reality. It understood her better than anyone ever could. "You know that this knowledge is what you've always wanted. You feel it, don't you? This power, this truth, this eternal understanding. Emma gritted her teeth, trying to push the voice away, but it was no use. The presence of the entity seemed to engulf her, creeping into every thought she had. The boundaries between her own will and the entity's desires blurred, until it felt impossible to know where she ended and the entity began. Emma's mind was a battleground now. She was caught between two opposing forces, the unrelenting pull of the entity and her desperate need to break free. Her desire for knowledge had always been one of her greatest motivations, but now it was twisted, corrupted by the entity's influence. Each page she turned, each word she read, only deepened her connection to the dark power that threatened to consume her. But at the same time, Emma could feel the hollowness of the knowledge she was uncovering. The truth that the entity offered wasn't just knowledge. It was a trap, a means of control, a way to bind her mind to something unnatural, something far beyond human comprehension. The entity's true nature began to reveal itself in flashes. It was ancient, far older than anything she had ever known, and it was using her to unlock its release from its eternal prison. A conflict raged inside her. Her mind wanted to push away from the manuscript, to stop reading, to close the book and walk away from the entity's grip. But her heart, her desire for more, to understand the forbidden, to see what lay beyond the veil, made it so hard to resist. She felt herself slowly surrendering to the entity's manipulations, its whispers weaving through her emotions, convincing her that the answers she sought were worth the cost. "You can stop this any time you wish, Emma. You just have to want it. Embrace the knowledge and you'll be free." But Emma knew it was a lie. The more she embraced, the more she felt herself being pulled into the darkness, into the entity's control. Her need for knowledge and fear of the unknown were at war inside her. She began to doubt herself. Had she always been this way, always driven by the desire for knowledge, always willing to push boundaries? Or had the entity shaped her thoughts, molded her desires from the start? Days turned into weeks, and Emma's attempts to stop reading the manuscript grew more desperate. She locked the book away in a drawer, telling herself that she wouldn't open it again. But each night the whispers came back. The entity's voice slithered into her thoughts, gentle at first, coaxing, promising her more answers if she just opened the manuscript for a moment. "Just one more page, Emma." She would stand by the drawer, fingers hovering over it, torn between the desire to resist and the compulsion to learn. And every time she would give in, her curiosity pushing her forward despite the fear that gnawed at her. The more she tried to resist, the more intense the entity's grip on her became. It wasn't just about the manuscript anymore. It was about her mind, her soul. The entity had made her its pawn, and the more she struggled, the tighter its hold became. The hallucinations and visions grew more vivid, more intense. She would hear the voice even when she wasn't near the manuscript, the whispers in the back of her mind telling her what to do. Her colleagues at the university began to notice her decline. They asked her if she was okay, if she was feeling overworked. But Emma brushed them off, her mind too preoccupied with the book and the entity's influence. She couldn't afford to explain what was happening. Who could she trust? How could she tell them that she was losing her grip on reality? That the entity had a hold of her and was slowly unraveling her mind? Her attempts to escape were futile. Every time she tried to walk away from the manuscript, she was pulled back into its grip. The entity's whispers became more insistent, more demanding, until one night, as she stood in the archives, she realized something terrible. She was no longer in control of her own actions. The entity had won. The grip of the entity had become an unbearable weight in Emma's mind. Each passing day felt like a battle for her sanity as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just about the manuscript. It was about survival, and Emma realized that if she didn't act soon, the entity would consume her completely. Her body was exhausted, her mind unraveling with every word she read. Fear, desperation, and curiosity had melded together, creating an internal storm that clouded her judgment. But amidst the chaos, one thought kept piercing through. She had to break free. It was on one of those sleepless nights when Emma, unable to rest, turned to the very manuscript that had entangled her. She needed answers, anything that could help her break free from the entity's control. With trembling hands, she opened the manuscript again, desperate for a solution. And there it was, a hidden passage near the end of the text, previously unnoticed in her feverish search for knowledge. The counter-ritual. The words seemed to glow as she read them, like a beacon of hope amidst the suffocating darkness. It described a method to sever the connection between her and the entity, a ritual that would break its hold on her mind and soul. But as Emma read through the steps, the horror settled in her chest like a stone. The counter-ritual wasn't simple. It wasn't even something that could be done lightly. It required personal sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. The more she read, the clearer it became. To escape the entity, she would need to give up something precious, something irreplaceable. The ritual described in the manuscript wasn't just about physical objects or symbols. It wasn't about invoking a spell to ward off the entity. No, the true cost of the counter-ritual was far more profound. It called for a sacrifice that would strike at the very heart of who Emma was. The manuscript explained that the connection between the summoner and the entity was formed through deep emotional and intellectual bonds. To sever the connection, Emma would need to cut ties with the very essence of her being. The ritual required her to give up her memories, her career, and perhaps even her humanity. Emma's hands trembled as she read the passage. The ritual demanded that she erase the life she had built, her academic career, her passion for historical research, the relationship she had fostered over the years. Her identity, forged through years of dedication, would be lost in the process. The ritual would strip her of the very memories that made her who she was, leaving her with nothing but a hollow shell. The manuscript also hinted at a darker aspect of the ritual. It wasn't just the loss of memories, it was the loss of self. The ritual could potentially alter her humanity, turning her into something less than human, a mere vessel for the entity's purpose forever changed. For a moment, Emma sat frozen, the weight of the decision settling heavily in her mind. She had spent years building her life, her career, her friends, her identity. But now it seemed that everything she had worked for could be wiped away in an instant. The very thought of sacrificing everything was overwhelming. Could she truly give up the life she knew? She imagined herself, stripped of her memories, her sense of self, wandering through the world, a mere shadow of who she once was. It was too much to bear. But then the entity's voice came again, whispering in her mind. "You know what to do, Emma. You've come this far." It was the voice of certainty, the voice of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate her. The words twisted in her mind, feeding on her fear, desperation, and need for freedom. The more she thought about it, the more the urge to act grew stronger. Was there truly another choice? Could she live the rest of her life under the entity's control, knowing that it would never let go? Could she endure forever, consumed by the entity's whispers and demands? No, she couldn't. Emma knew deep down that the only way to regain control of her life was to make the sacrifice. The cost was high, but it was the only option. If she didn't act now, the entity would eventually take everything, her mind, her soul, her very essence. Emma stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. She paced back and forth in the small room, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The entity's whispers seemed to grow louder, urging her to act, to complete the ritual. Her hand reached for the manuscript again, almost instinctively. She hesitated, the fear of what she was about to do flooding her mind. But then she remembered the nightmares, the hallucinations, the relentless presence of the entity in her thoughts. She remembered how close she had come to losing herself entirely, how fragile her grip on reality had become. Emma closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no more time for hesitation. She had crossed a line already, and there was no turning back. The entity had already begun to consume her, and if she didn't do something now, she would never escape. Taking a deep breath, Emma nodded to herself. She would attempt the ritual. She would follow the instructions in the manuscript, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had worked for. She would do it to break free from the entity's hold, to reclaim her life before it was too late. Her fingers trembled as she began to prepare the materials for the ritual, gathering the objects described in the manuscript. But even as she did, a part of her couldn't help but wonder. What would happen to her once she performed the ritual? Would she ever truly be the same again? But there was no time for doubt. The entity had already made its presence felt, and Emma knew that if she didn't act now, the entity would consume her completely. The sacrifice was necessary, and Emma was desperate enough to make it. With the ritual prepared and the final step in place, Emma stood tall. She was ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant losing everything she had ever known. The battle for her mind and soul was about to reach its climax, and she could only pray that the ritual would work before the entity claimed her completely. Emma stood in the middle of her apartment, the ritual materials arranged meticulously around her. The manuscript, now closed, rested on the table in front of her, its weight almost palpable. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the very space she occupied had been transformed by the darkness of what she was about to attempt. The entity's presence had been building inside her, and she knew that this final act would either sever its hold or completely destroy her. With a deep breath, Emma began. The first step of the count ritual was simple enough, lighting the sacred candles and placing them in the designated positions. She recited the first line of the chant in a whisper, the words foreign but carrying a strange power. The candles flickered in response, as if acknowledging her intent. Emma's pulse quickened. It felt like the calm before a storm, but the storm was already gathering on the horizon. As she moved to the next step, the room seemed to shift. The shadows deepened and a cold, clammy sensation crawled over her skin. Emma's heartbeat began to race and she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to falter now, but the whispers came louder this time, piercing through her thoughts like razor-sharp tendrils. "You think you can escape me, Emma?" The voice was unmistakable now. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was real, present, like a weight on her chest, suffocating her breath. "You can't break free. You belong to me." She flinched but pressed on, determined to continue. Every word, every movement was a battle against the overwhelming force that sought to drag her back into its grip. Suddenly, the room shifted violently. The lights flickered, the candles sputtered, and the temperature dropped. Emma felt a wave of dread crash over her as the entity began to amplify her deepest fears. The shadows around her seemed to morph, taking on the forms of terrifying, monstrous shapes, faces from her past, distorted figures, all staring at her with eyes full of malice. A vision of her mother, pale and gaunt, appeared before her, looking at her with disappointment. Emma's chest tightened. Her fear of losing her family, of being the one to bring danger to those she loved, was being used against her. "You think you can save them, Emma. You can't even save yourself." The voice in her head mocked her, now swarming her thoughts. The faces of her friends and colleagues filled the room, their expressions twisted into ones of horror, as though they were all standing there watching her fail. The entity's presence grew stronger with every hallucination, every fearful thought Emma had. But Emma wasn't ready to give in. She clenched her fists, grounding herself. The ritual was all she had left. She had to stay focused, no matter what. The entity was desperate, and so was she. Emma moved to the next step, forcing herself to chant the words from the manuscript aloud. The air grew thick, vibrating with a dark energy that pressed down on her chest. As she spoke the incantation, the ground beneath her feet shuddered, and the lights flickered more violently. The entity was fighting her, and it was winning. The room seemed to dissolve around her. One moment she was standing in her apartment. The next, she was back in the ancient ruins she had seen in her nightmares, the dark, desolate landscapes that had haunted her for weeks. The black sky above her seemed to be alive, swirling with ancient symbols and impossible geometries that defied understanding. "You cannot escape, Emma. I am within you now. You are mine." The voice was everywhere, filling her mind, drowning out everything else. It pulled at her thoughts, tangled her emotions, and fed on her fear. Every word she spoke in the ritual, the entity twisted, using it to pull her deeper into its grasp. The chaos around her intensified. As the entity's presence surged, Emma felt herself losing control of the ritual. She stumbled over her words, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The tension was unbearable, the air electric, and her heart was pounding in her chest, almost as though it were about to burst. "You will fail, Emma. I will take everything, your memories, your life, your soul." The voice mocked her, its tone dripping with cruelty. "You cannot break free. You belong to me, and you always will." The words cut through her like blades, their truth sinking deep into her soul. Emma's grip on the ritual slipped, and the light from the candles flickered erratically, casting wild shadows that seemed to mock her. The entity's power overwhelmed her senses, and for a brief moment she thought she might lose everything. She couldn't do it. She couldn't win. But then something inside her snapped. It was the fear of losing herself, of becoming a mere vessel for the entity. That gave her strength. She remembered everything she had worked for, the years of dedication, the sacrifices she had made for her academic career and family. Emma remembered why she had started this journey. She hadn't come this far to lose everything now. With renewed resolve, she slammed her hand onto the table, her palms smoldering against the heat of the candles. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking but determined. "I will not become you." The entity's power surged, pushing back at her thoughts, but Emma refused to break. Her voice grew stronger, her words more focused as she completed the incantation. The symbols she had drawn on the floor began to glow, faint at first, and then blazing bright with a white-hot light. The room began to tremble, the air crackling with an energy that made Emma's skin prickle. For a moment, the entity's presence grew frantic, its voice rising in desperation. "You can't win, Emma. I will destroy you." It shouted, but Emma pushed forward, knowing this was her only chance. With every word, the light grew brighter, and the entity's influence seemed to diminish. Emma's vision swam as she fought to keep her focus. The entity's whispers still echoed in her mind, but now they felt distant, growing weaker as the light enveloped her. She completed the final phrase of the ritual, the last words of the incantation leaving her lips in a rush of air. A pulse of light exploded from the symbols on the floor, the energy of the ritual crashing through the room like a wave, flooding her senses. The darkness, the voice, the entity, they were pushed back, its hold finally breaking. Emma fell to her knees, breathing heavily, tears streaming down her face. She had done it. The entity's power had been severed. The ritual had worked. But she wasn't sure what it had cost her. She had made it through, but at what price? Emma felt a sense of overwhelming relief as the entity's presence began to dissipate. The air around her, once thick with its dark power, seemed to clear, as if the ritual had truly severed the connection. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but for the first time in weeks, her mind felt clear. The voices were gone. The whispers that had once haunted her thoughts were silent. She exhaled shakily, her chest heaving with the weight of what she had just done. But as she tried to stand, her vision blurred and she stumbled, barely able to keep herself upright. The familiar weight that had pressed on her chest since the entity first spoke to her returned. Something was wrong. The air in the room shifted and she froze, a chill crawling up her spine. Emma turned slowly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. She wasn't alone. The entity's voice returned, but this time it was not in her mind. It was physical, echoing through the very air around her. "You've done well, Emma," the voice said, its tone different now, calm, almost soothing. It had lost the bitterness and anger from before. "You've performed the ritual perfectly, but I must tell you the truth." Emma's heart pounded. She had succeeded, hadn't she? The connection was broken, the entity's influence dissipating, wasn't it? Why did she still feel it here, lingering in the corners of the room? "You think you have freed yourself, but you've only begun to uncover the truth." The entity's voice was now heavy with sadness, a hint of something that sounded almost like regret. Asterisk, I am not the evil you think I am, Emma. I was never truly evil. I was a victim of ancient forces much greater than me. The revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. What? For a moment, she could hardly comprehend what she was hearing. The entity, not evil. The being she had been so terrified of, the force that had manipulated her for weeks, was not the villain after all. How could that be possible? The voice continued, now gentle but still filled with an undeniable gravity. Asterisk, I have been trapped, bound, imprisoned by powers far beyond anything you can imagine. The manuscript, this cursed manuscript you've been reading, is the key to my freedom. You see, you didn't just summon me. You summoned yourself, Emma. I have been watching you. Your curiosity, your need to know, the drive to understand, it has been my only chance for release. Emma felt her knees weaken and she staggered back, leaning against the desk. The truth was becoming clearer, but it made no sense. Everything she had done, everything she had sacrificed, had been to break the entity's control. But now it was telling her that it had manipulated her. It had known all along that Emma's desire for knowledge would lead her to this very moment. Emma listened, speechless, as the entity revealed its plan. It explained how it had infiltrated her thoughts, fed off her curiosity, and exploited her fear to push her toward performing the count ritual. It wasn't just about breaking free. It was about using her, manipulating her to become its vessel, its escape from the prison it had been trapped in for millennia. "I needed you, Emma. Your mind, your knowledge, your drive." The entity continued, its voice now softer, almost sympathetic. "You were the one who would finally free me, but not just free me. You were meant to become the vessel for my return. You are perfect, Emma. A scholar, a researcher, someone whose mind has been open to the ancient ways. You are now the key to unlocking the next step of my freedom." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She shook her head, denying what she was hearing. No, this couldn't be true. She had performed the ritual. She had broken the connection, hadn't she? But the entity's voice was calm as it explained the truth. "You can't stop now. The ritual was never meant to just break me free. It was meant to reawaken me, to reunite me with this world. You, Emma, were the final piece. Your mind, your spirit, your willingness to listen. That's why I chose you." Emma's pulse quickened, her thoughts racing. How could she have been so blind? She had been so consumed by her obsession with the manuscript, so desperate for answers, that she had failed to see the bigger picture. The entity hadn't been trying to escape, it had been using her all along. A cold realization settled in her gut. She had been manipulated, used by the entity all along. Her curiosity, her search for knowledge, had played right into its hands. It wasn't just a struggle to break free. It was a battle for her soul, and she had walked right into the trap. The entity's voice continued to speak in her mind, now softer, almost coaxing, but still filled with the same deep pulling power. "You don't need to fight, Emma. You've already brought me here. You've already opened the door. Let me finish it. Let me live once more. You won't regret it. Think of the power I could give you, the knowledge, the understanding of everything. You could have everything you've ever dreamed of, all the secrets of the universe at your fingertips." Emma stood frozen, her mind reeling. What could she do now? If she completed the ritual, she would be setting the entity free. But if she didn't, she would be destroyed, just as the entity had promised. She looked at the manuscript lying on the table, its dark power still emanating from it, as though the answer was there, waiting for her. Was it even her choice anymore? Had she already sealed her fate by reading it? Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the magnitude of what she was facing. Could she really let the entity escape? The power it promised was tempting, a lifetime of knowledge, the unraveling of all the mysteries she had ever wanted to understand. But what would it cost her? Would she lose her soul, her humanity? Would she become a mere puppet for the entity's desires? Would the world be at the mercy of this ancient being? Her heart raced, and for the first time, Emma realized that the only way out was to decide. The final choice was hers. Emma stood before the manuscript, her hands shaking as she held the final pages of the ritual in front of her. The light in the room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, flickering in time with the pounding in her chest. Everything she had fought for, everything she had tried to resist, had brought her to this final moment. There was no going back now. The entity's voice still echoed in her mind, persistent, tempting, a dark presence whispering promises of ultimate power and knowledge beyond comprehension. It had offered her the world, but Emma had seen through its lies. She understood now. The price of that power was not just her life, but her soul, her humanity. The entity had used her for its own escape, manipulating her curiosity and fear to get exactly what it wanted. But now, as she faced the final step of the count ritual, Emma knew what had to be done. To sever the connection, to truly rid herself of the entity's influence, she would have to make the ultimate sacrifice, a sacrifice that would destroy everything she had ever known. It wasn't just about severing the bond between her and the entity. It was about destroying everything she was, her identity, her memories, and perhaps her humanity itself. The entity's grip on her mind had been all-encompassing, but the final act required something far more profound. The ritual was designed to obliterate the link between her and the entity, but it demanded a personal cost, a cost that would render her nothing but a hollow vessel of lost memories. Emma took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Could she do this? Could she let go of everything she had been? Could she give up her life, her career, the memories of her family, her friends, the person she had become over the years? The weight of the decision pressed on her, but in her heart, she knew there was no other way. The world depended on her choice. The ritual had to be completed, but to do so, she had to release herself completely, not just from the entity, but from everything she had once been. As Emma began the final incantation, preparing to perform the ultimate sacrifice, the entity's voice surged in her mind. It wasn't the quiet whispers anymore. It was loud, commanding, filled with an intensity that threatened to overwhelm her. "You can't do this, Emma." The voice was urgent, almost pleading now, desperate. "You are mine. You have always been mine, all of this. It has been leading to this moment. You don't understand what you are giving up. I can give you everything you've ever dreamed of." The voice seemed to hum with power, its tone dripping with false promises. "You think you are saving the world, but you are only condemning yourself. You cannot escape what you are becoming. Join me. I can give you immortality. I can make you one of us, a being of pure power, beyond time, beyond death." Emma's hands trembled as the words tried to penetrate her resolve, attempting to twist her will to lure her back into the entity's grasp. The thought of immortality, of unimaginable power, whispered sweetly in her ear, and for a moment Emma felt a surge of temptation. The entity's offer was almost too perfect, too tempting. It promised freedom from the pain of her sacrifice, the chance to escape the consequences of her actions. But then she remembered everything: the faces of her family, the life she had built, the knowledge she had lost in the search for something more. The entity's words were lies designed to keep her bound to its influence. She knew the truth now. The power it offered wasn't freedom, it was captivity. "I won't join you, I'll never join you." Emma's voice was steady now, her resolve hardening like iron. She had made her choice. The entity's voice faltered, a slight crack in its once imposing presence. "You're making a mistake, Emma. You will regret this." But Emma didn't listen. She focused on the ritual, her hands steady as she continued the final incantation. The air around her hummed with dark energy, the light from the candles flickering in a frenzy, casting wild shadows across the room. She could feel the entity's fury, its anger crashing against her mind like waves against the shore. It wasn't going to give up easily. Emma's body shook as she completed the final steps of the ritual. Her breath was shallow, her vision starting to blur, but she refused to stop. She knew the sacrifice would be irreversible. If she succeeded, she would be forever changed, but if she failed, the entity would be free and the world would suffer. She whispered the final words of the incantation, feeling the power of the ritual surge through her. The room shuddered, and a blinding light erupted from the floor, encasing her in a cocoon of pure energy. For a moment, it felt like the very fabric of reality was being torn apart around her. The light was so bright, so intense, that she could hardly see anything. In that moment, the entity's voice screamed in her mind, its power battling against hers, trying to pull her back into its influence. "You cannot stop me. I will make you regret this." The entity howled, but Emma pushed forward. She could feel herself slipping, her memories, her identity, everything she had ever known beginning to flicker away. But Emma held on, her willpower stronger than it had ever been. With a final, desperate cry, Emma completed the ritual, and the light exploded outward, filling the room with an otherworldly brilliance. The entity screamed one last time, its voice a mixture of rage, fear, and desperation, but Emma didn't hear it anymore. The light enveloped her completely and she felt the world shift. The connection was severed. The entity's hold on her was broken. Emma collapsed to the floor, exhausted, her body cold and trembling from the intense energy she had just channeled. The room was silent now, eerily so. For a long moment, Emma didn't move. She lay there staring at the empty space where the entity had once existed. It was over. But Emma knew that she was no longer the same person. She had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the world, and in doing so she had lost everything she had once known. Her memories were a blur, her identity fractured, but she was free. The world was safe for now. Emma woke to an overwhelming silence. Her body was cold, her limbs stiff, and her mind a blur. The world around her seemed faint and distant, as if she were looking through a fogged window disconnected from everything. She lay on the cold floor of her apartment, unable to move at first, every fiber of her being drained from the battle she had just fought. The ritual had taken its toll, physically and mentally. She had completed it, severing the entity's grip on her soul, but the price was steep. Her head throbbed as though it might crack open from the strain. Every muscle in her body felt like it had been pulled apart, and she could hardly bring herself to open her eyes. It was as if the very act of breaking free had torn her apart, leaving her with a hollow emptiness that would take time to fill. She could feel the exhaustion gnawing at her, the loss of herself now settling in like an anchor she could never escape. Her mind, still foggy from the ritual, struggled to recall what had happened. Everything felt like a distant dream, the memories fragmented. She remembered the entity's power, the light, and the sacrifice she had made. She had won, but the cost was more than she could have anticipated. She had lost her identity, her memories, and perhaps part of her humanity in the process. For a long moment, Emma simply lay there, her eyes closed, allowing herself to recover. The air felt still, the silence suffocating. The entity's presence, the dark weight that had once clouded her mind, was gone, but she knew that its influence had left permanent scars on her. It wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for her soul, and though she had emerged victorious, she was not unscathed. But as the minutes passed, Emma could feel it, the residual echo of the entity's power still lingering in the air. The whispers were gone, but the anger, the fury of the entity had not dissipated. It was only temporarily defeated, not destroyed. Emma could almost hear its voice again, its words filled with vengeance. "You cannot escape me forever, Emma." The voice echoed in her mind, not as an immediate command, but as a promise, a warning that echoed through her very being. "You have broken the connection, but I will find you again. No one can hide from me for long." Emma shuddered, the weight of those words sinking in. She had won for now, but she knew the entity's anger would not be easily quelled. It would never forget the humiliation of being trapped again, of being thwarted by a mere mortal. The entity's fury would surely continue to grow, and Emma would never be able to escape it completely. "This is not over." The voice faded, but Emma felt it still. It was alive, and it would be watching her every move. She had severed the bond, but there would be no true peace, no complete freedom until the entity had exhausted its thirst for revenge. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the truth of the entity's words. She had escaped, but not without consequences. The entity's promise of vengeance hung over her like a shadow she couldn't shake off. As the days passed, Emma began to piece herself back together, but she knew she could never go back to the life she once had. Her mind was no longer the same. It was fractured, shattered by the darkness she had experienced and the memories she had lost. She had sacrificed so much of herself to rid the world of the entity's influence. But in doing so, she had been reborn, although not in the way she had imagined. Her once bright and passionate pursuit of knowledge now felt hollow. The curiosity that had once driven her to study ancient manuscripts was now tainted, as though the very search for truth had led her down a path she could never have anticipated. The cost of knowledge had been far too high, but Emma was determined to rebuild her life. She was no longer the same person. She could never be the scholar she had once been, with the innocent curiosity that had defined her early career. But she was alive, and that in itself was a gift she didn't take lightly. She began to withdraw from the world of academia, not because she didn't love the work, but because she could no longer approach it with the same unwavering passion. Her mind was too tainted by the memories of what she had gone through, and she couldn't risk letting the same obsession take over again. Instead, Emma found a new purpose, a quiet, more humble life. She left the university behind and found work in a small library, cataloging historical documents in a peaceful town far away from the chaos she had endured. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, but it was the life she could now live without the constant shadow of the entity hanging over her. But even in the quiet moments, Emma felt a restlessness within her. The knowledge she had uncovered, the truth she had learned, were always just beneath the surface, like a part of herself that she could never quite leave behind. It was as though the entity's presence still lingered in the corners of her mind, reminding her that it had not truly been defeated, only delayed. Emma knew that she would never be free of the entity's influence. Its fury might subside, but it would always be there, waiting, watching, and plotting its next move. But for now, she was safe, living a life that was quieter, more controlled, and more focused on the things she could still hold onto. Her soul, though scarred, was still hers. Emma stepped off the bus into the small town that would now be her home. The quiet streets and charming houses felt like a world away from the chaos she had left behind. The memories of the manuscript, the entity, and the darkness that had consumed her were still fresh in her mind, like scars on her soul, but she was determined to put it all behind her. This town was her escape, her chance to find some semblance of normalcy, far away from the life she had once known. She had chosen this town carefully. It was a place where she could blend in, where no one knew her, no one would ask questions about her past, about her career at the university, about the terrible choices she had made. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town, a place where she could start fresh, rebuild her life. The walls felt sturdy and safe, like a fortress against the world she had once inhabited. The library in the center of town hired her as a cataloger. It wasn't the high-profile academic position she had once dreamed of, but it was a job that allowed her to stay close to the written word, the one thing she had always loved. She spent her days sorting through ancient texts, preserving them for future generations. It wasn't the same as working with the manuscripts of the past, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. As the days turned into weeks, Emma's routine became predictable, comfortable even. She would wake up early, walk to the library, spend her hours organizing and cataloging, then return to her cottage to prepare a simple meal. She kept to herself, rarely interacting with the townspeople, keeping her head down and her thoughts focused on the present. She didn't need to think about the past. She didn't need to think about the entity that had haunted her for so long. But despite her best efforts, the memories lingered. At night, when the world was still and the shadows stretched long across her walls, Emma would find herself remembering the manuscript, the words that had unlocked the door to the entity. She would hear the whispers, faint but undeniable, echoing in the back of her mind. The pain of the sacrifice she had made, the loss of her identity, all resurfaced in those quiet, lonely hours. Emma had given up everything in her quest to break free. She had sacrificed her career, her memories, and her very soul to rid herself of the entity's influence. And yet, as she sat in her cottage, the emptiness she felt was suffocating. She couldn't escape the void left by the loss of her identity. Who was she now? Without her passion for ancient texts, without her work at the university, without the purpose she had once had, who was Emma? The person she had once been felt foreign to her now, someone she could barely recognize. The connections she had with others, the relationships she had built over the years, seemed like shadows of a life that had been erased, like a dream she had once lived but could never return to. Her family was no longer a part of her life. Her memories of them were hazy, lost in the process of the ritual. The faces of her friends, colleagues, and loved ones seemed like blurred images in her mind, nothing but fragments of a life she could never fully reclaim. The sacrifice had taken more than just her memories. It had taken her sense of self, her connection to the world. Emma tried to move forward, but the pain of the past weighed heavily on her heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost something more than just her career and her identity. She had lost a part of herself. Something deep inside her had been sacrificed in that final ritual, and no matter how much she tried to rebuild, she couldn't fill the hole it had left behind. She had tried to move on, to embrace the quiet life she had chosen, but the shadow of what she had lost followed her. The loss of her past was a burden she could not escape, and it weighed on her more heavily with each passing day. Despite her efforts to create a new life, Emma could not escape the entity. It had not been defeated, not truly. The ritual may have severed the connection, but it had not destroyed the entity. It was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting. She could feel its presence even now in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to think too deeply. At night, the dreams came. Visions of the entity, dark, shadowy figures danced in her mind. They were never clear, never fully formed, but she knew they were watching her, waiting for her to slip up. The whispers were faint, but they were there, lingering at the edges of her consciousness. She could never truly escape the feeling of being watched, of being observed, as though the entity was still trying to find a way back into her life. Sometimes, Emma thought she could feel the presence of the entity standing just behind her, its shadow stretching across the walls, waiting for her to make a mistake. It wanted to claim her once again, to use her as its vessel for freedom, and no matter how far she tried to run, it always seemed to be there, just out of reach. She had thought that moving away, starting over, would free her from its influence. But she was wrong. The entity was not bound by space or time. Its presence followed her, not in the physical world, but in the space between her thoughts, in the deep recesses of her mind. Her escape was only temporary, and every day, Emma felt herself inching closer to the realization that she would never be truly free. The entity had not been vanquished. It had simply been delayed, and until it found a way to break through again, Emma would always feel its lingering presence. For months, Emma had been living in the small town, trying to put her life back together, each day filled with the struggle of rebuilding herself from the wreckage left behind by the entity. The whispers had grown quieter, the hallucinations less frequent. It seemed that at last she had escaped its clutches, or so she believed. But deep in her heart, Emma had known the entity would return. She had sensed it, the unsettling feeling that something was amiss, a nagging emptiness that she couldn't quite shake. Then, one evening, as Emma sat in the library, cataloging another set of old texts, she came across something that made her blood run cold. A letter addressed to a prominent scholar at the university, detailing a discovery of a strange manuscript, a manuscript with the same markings as the one she had once studied. The warning words, "Do not process," stood out in the letter like a red flag, just as it had in her past. The letter was from a researcher who had uncovered the manuscript while working in remote archives. Emma's pulse quickened as she read the description. It sounded like the same cursed text, the same dark power that had consumed her life months ago. The entity had learned. It had adapted, and now it was seeking others to do its bidding. It was manipulating new scholars, drawing them in just as it had with her. It had found a way to use them, these innocent researchers, as vessels for its return, exploiting their curiosity and desire for knowledge to further its escape. The cycle she had tried to stop was not over. It had only just begun again. Emma closed her eyes, the weight of the realization crashing down on her. The entity was manipulating others, and this time it was learning from her. She had thought that by breaking the connection, she had severed its hold on the world, but she had been wrong. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. In the following weeks, Emma noticed more signs, subtle, disturbing signs, that the entity was reaching out, not just through manuscripts, but through the scholars she once knew. Her old colleagues from the university began to disappear. One by one, they were reported as transferred to other institutions. Their work on historical texts abruptly halted. But Emma knew the truth. They had been taken. They had fallen into the same trap she once did. One evening, Emma received a message from an old friend, David, the one colleague who had once tried to help her, asking for her help in understanding a mysterious manuscript he had found while working on a recent excavation. It was a fragment, an ancient text that matched the same description of the cursed manuscript. The warning signs were unmistakable, and as Emma read his message, she could feel the entity's presence lurking in the background, feeding off their curiosity once again. The message was brief, and its last line made Emma's stomach drop. "I can't stop reading it. It's like it's calling to me." David had already begun to fall under the entity's control. Emma could see it. The cycle was repeating, and she realized with a sickening certainty that it was only a matter of time before David was lost just as she had been. The entity had been waiting, watching, learning from its past mistakes. It had learned how to manipulate the very people who had once been immune to its influence. Scholars, researchers, those who sought the truth. Now they were nothing more than puppets, vessels for the entity's return. The more Emma thought about it, the more she knew that the battle was far from over. The entity wasn't just manipulating scholars. It was setting the stage for a new wave of destruction. And this time, Emma wouldn't be able to stop it unless she acted quickly. She couldn't just sit back and watch as others were consumed by the same darkness that had almost destroyed her. Emma knew what she had to do. She had to confront the entity once again. This time, she couldn't afford to make the same mistakes. She couldn't let the entity use anyone else, not the way it had used her. It had taken so much from her already. Her memories, her career, the very soul she had fought to hold on to. She couldn't let it destroy anyone else. The decision weighed heavily on her, but Emma knew it was the only choice she had. She would need to return to the manuscript, return to the dark force that had nearly destroyed her. She would need to face the entity head-on, this time with the knowledge that it wasn't just trying to escape, it was trying to use her again. And this time, she had to stop it permanently. She gathered the materials she would need for the count ritual, the same ritual she had used to break the entity's hold. But this time, it wouldn't be enough to sever the connection. She had to destroy it. She couldn't just seal it away again. She couldn't just lock it back in its prison. She had to destroy it for good, to keep it from ever coming back. As she prepared for the final confrontation, Emma felt a sense of clarity she hadn't had in months. She had faced the darkness before, and though she had sacrificed so much, she had survived. She had learned from her mistakes, and she would not let herself fall prey to the same temptations again. The entity would not win this time. She would make sure of it. This was no longer a battle for her soul alone. It was a battle for the future, for the world. Emma stood up, resolute, ready to fight once again. The entity may have learned, but so had she. And this time she would make sure it would never escape again. The university loomed ahead of Emma, its ancient stone facade a stark reminder of everything she had tried to escape. The archives, the place where it all began, where she had uncovered the manuscript and set in motion the dark chain of events that had consumed her life, now felt like a graveyard of her past. The evening air was cool, the campus unusually quiet as Emma made her way through the familiar streets. She had come back not for the work she once loved, but for something far more important. The entity had followed her, manipulated her, and now it had claimed others. She couldn't allow it to continue. The fight had come full circle, and she knew deep in her bones that the final confrontation had to take place here, in this place of knowledge and power. As she stepped into the university building, the echoing silence felt oppressive. The scent of old books and dust filled the air, familiar but now tinged with dread. Emma had spent countless hours in these halls, poring over ancient texts, chasing after knowledge. But today, those walls felt like a prison, a trap, the very place where the entity's dark influence had first begun to take root. She walked straight toward the archives, her heart racing as she approached the familiar doors. Inside, the shelves were lined with ancient manuscripts, the place where she had once felt so connected to history. Now it felt like a tomb. The manuscript, the key to the entity's power, was still there, hidden in a secure room. The entity had been waiting for this moment, watching her from the shadows of her mind. Emma had no doubt that it would do everything in its power to stop her, but this time she was prepared. She had learned, had grown stronger in her resolve. She would not be manipulated again. The door to the secure archive room opened with a creak, and Emma stepped inside. The manuscript, resting on a pedestal, called to her, its power still intact, its dark energy swirling around it like a storm. She could feel the entity watching her, its presence filling the room, suffocating her thoughts. "You've returned." The voice was soft, but its weight felt heavy, like a dark cloud pressing down on her chest. The entity had woven itself into her thoughts, but she could feel that it was weaker now. She had come prepared. "Yes, and this time, I'm here to end it." Emma's voice was steady, though her heart hammered in her chest. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. The fight would be hard, but she wasn't going to let the entity control her life, or anyone else's, ever again. The room seemed to darken around her as the entity's presence intensified. Emma stood firm, her body taut, every muscle prepared for the battle she knew was coming. The darkness in the air began to swirl, and the entity's voice filled her mind, louder and more commanding than ever. "You think you can stop me, Emma? You are nothing without me." The voice was sharp, like the crack of thunder, and it was everywhere, in the walls, in her mind, in her very bones. "You cannot defeat me. You are weak, a mortal." Emma's mind screamed in resistance. She had fought this battle before, not just physically, but mentally. The entity had tried to destroy her, to twist her fears and desires into weapons against her. But she was stronger now. The ritual she had performed had prepared her, had given her the tools she needed to fight back. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The entity materialized, its form flickering in and out of existence, like a black mist swirling around her trying to suffocate her thoughts. Emma focused, drawing on her willpower as she began to speak the count-ritual she had studied. By the light of truth I sever the bond. By the strength of will I claim my freedom. She whispered the words slowly, focusing on each syllable, feeling the power of the ritual surge through her. The entity screamed, its voice a cacophony of rage and fury, but Emma didn't falter. The darkness around her pressed in, but she resisted, channeling all of her energy into the ritual. The entity fought back, throwing visions of horror, of death, of things Emma could never have imagined. Her mind flashed to images of her family, her colleagues, everyone she had lost in the process of this endless struggle. "You cannot win, Emma. You are mine." The entity roared, its voice distorting, becoming more monstrous. It reached out, trying to drag her into the darkness again, to consume her. But Emma held firm, her hands steady as she completed the final incantation. The room shuddered, and the manuscript on the pedestal began to glow, its dark energy starting to push against her. The entity fought with all its power, but Emma refused to be manipulated any longer. She could feel the power of the ritual coursing through her, pushing back against the entity's influence. And she knew this was the moment. This was her chance to end it all. "This is the end," Emma whispered, the final words of the count-ritual leaving her lips with absolute resolve. The manuscript lay in front of Emma, its pages still, its power slowly fading, but the air in the room was still charged with the entity's influence. Emma could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest, the last step she had to take to break the cycle once and for all. The entity was not gone yet. It was still lingering, its power still clinging to her thoughts, trying to regain control. She had come so far, sacrificed so much, and now the end was within reach. The entity's voice echoed in her mind, faint and desperate, a last attempt to manipulate her one final time. "You can't do this, Emma. You've already destroyed so much of yourself. Why sacrifice everything now?" Its whispers were no longer persuasive. They were desperate, knowing that its time was up. It was losing, and it was doing everything in its power to cling to the last thread of its existence. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the entity's power still trying to worm its way into her thoughts. But this time she was stronger. She had faced the entity's manipulations, its threats, and its promises of power and immortality. And this time she had made her choice. She couldn't let it win. She couldn't let it keep manipulating others, using them as vessels for its return. She stood tall, steadying her breath, drawing on the strength she had found through the countless battles she had already fought. The sacrifice had been immense, but it was the only way forward. She reached for the manuscript with a final resolve, no more hesitation, no more compromises. The counter-ritual she had prepared was the last step in destroying the entity once and for all. She could feel its dark power still in the air, still trying to sink into her, but Emma knew she had to push forward. There could be no more hesitation. Emma began to chant the final words, her voice strong and clear. She felt the energy surge around her as she spoke the incantation, the final part of the ritual that would banish the entity forever. The room trembled, the manuscript glowing brighter as the dark power tried to resist. But Emma didn't falter. She had faced its darkness before, and this time she wasn't afraid. With the last word of the ritual spoken, there was a blinding flash, a sudden explosion of light that filled the room. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the power rush through her, the final severing of the connection between her and the entity. The light enveloped her, and she could hear the entity's last scream in her mind, a sound of rage and defeat. And then all at once the darkness was gone. The weight lifted, the whispers stopped. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emma felt complete silence. Emma opened her eyes slowly, the world around her feeling strangely still. She looked at the manuscript, now lifeless, its power gone. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of pages in the wind. The entity was gone, but the aftershocks of her struggle were still within her. Her heart raced, and she felt the full weight of what had just happened, the exhaustion settling in like a deep ache. She had won, yes. The entity was no more. It had been destroyed, its power broken. But Emma knew that the battle had come at a price. She had sacrificed so much, her memories, her identity, her very sense of self. She could feel the emptiness inside her, the gaps that had been left behind by the ritual. Her life would never be the same. The memories of her time with the entity, the torment, the manipulation would haunt her forever. Emma closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The weight of the decision still pressed on her chest, but for the first time in a long while, she could breathe freely. She had stopped the entity from returning to the world, from manipulating others, from continuing its reign of fear and torment. She had done the right thing, but it had cost her dearly. The peace she had fought for was finally hers, but it was not without its sacrifices. She would never be the same. But Emma didn't regret her decision. The entity would never hurt anyone again, and that was worth every loss. Emma boarded the plane, feeling the hum of the engines vibrate beneath her. She gazed out the window at the sprawling city she was leaving behind, the university, the archives, the memories of her past life, all growing smaller and smaller as the plane ascended. She wasn't just leaving a place. She was leaving behind everything that had defined her for years. The manuscript, the entity, and the dark pursuit of forbidden knowledge had consumed her, and now it was time to let it all go. Her destination was a small town on the coast, far from the world of ancient manuscripts and hidden archives she once lived in. She had chosen this new life carefully. It was quiet, peaceful, a far cry from the frantic, obsessive existence she had once known. There would be no more ancient texts to uncover, no more dangerous rituals to perform. This new life would be built on simplicity and peace, a life where she could learn to live again, without fear or the shadow of the entity. The flight felt like a symbolic break, as if each mile that took her further from her past was another step toward a future of freedom. Emma didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt the stirrings of hope. Hope for a life that wasn't driven by the ghosts of the past, a life where she could finally find herself again. A new beginning was waiting for her. When Emma arrived at her new home, she felt the weight of the world lifting off her shoulders. The small cottage near the ocean was perfect, a quiet retreat surrounded by nature, with no traces of her past life. The walls were bare, the rooms unadorned, but they felt safe, and that was all Emma needed. The crashing waves against the shore became a constant reminder of the peace she had fought so hard to attain. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Emma began to settle into her new routine. She spent her mornings walking along the beach, feeling the sand between her toes and the salt air filling her lungs. She found comfort in the simple beauty of her surroundings, the gentle rhythm of the waves, the distant call of seagulls. For the first time in a long while, Emma felt at ease, no longer burdened by the entity's whispers or the need to seek out dangerous knowledge. But even as she found solace in her new life, Emma knew that the entity's influence was never completely gone. She could still feel it, faintly, like an old wound that never fully healed. The memories of the entity, the fear, and the manipulation were still there, lurking in the back of her mind. Sometimes, when the silence of the house grew too loud, she could feel the presence again, faint but unmistakable, a reminder of how close it had come to destroying her. Yet she refused to let it control her. She chose to live, to embrace the peace she had found, and to move forward. The entity may have haunted her, but it would never have the power to dictate her life again. Emma had learned the hard way that there were some things in life that could never be fully erased, but they could be outlasted, and she would outlast it. As Emma sat by the window of her cottage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she reflected on the journey she had traveled, the search for knowledge, the price of curiosity, and the cost of trying to understand the unknown. She thought about the manuscript and the entity that had almost consumed her, and she realized that her quest for answers had nearly cost her everything. The entity had promised power, immortality, and secrets beyond comprehension, but in the end, it had offered nothing but destruction. Emma had learned that some knowledge was too dangerous, too corrupting to pursue. There were things in this world that could never be understood, things best left untouched. The sun had now fully set, and Emma closed her eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. She had survived, and she had learned to let go. Knowledge, she now understood, was only valuable if it was pursued with wisdom, a wisdom that came from knowing when to stop, when to walk away, and when to let go. Emma smiled softly to herself. The journey had been long and the scars would never fully fade, but she had found peace. And that was worth more than any knowledge, more than any answers she had once sought. She was free, and she was finally at peace with the life she had chosen. As the sound of the waves filled the air, Emma whispered a quiet promise to herself. She would never again chase after the unknown. She would live in the moment and let the future come as it would. The entity was gone, and so was the endless need to understand everything. Her new life had begun, and this time she was ready to embrace it.